Okay, so Malik, so we're picking up. I think this is our fourth video on self-control and all things related, which I'm looking forward to getting into. Been one of those days where I was hoping to get into this a little bit earlier, but as with life, things crop up. So you had a list previously, I think. I don't know if
Yeah.
we're doing questions today or what
No.
is it you want to do?
Okay. So now we thought going to talk about fatigue.
Oh, fatigue related to self-control. Absolutely.
Yeah, because it's all connected. The more we're talking about everything is interlinked. It's so interesting.
Absolutely.
Okay. So the fatigue conversation came up in school, right? We had that mind map Monday, and that was the topic.
Yep.
Something everyone could relate.
Yep.
I was kind of following up that conversation and reading a little bit more about it.
Okay, I'm interested to hear what you
And
found.
well, so why are we talking about fatigue actually?
So with the Mind Map Monday call on the
What
previous Monday, the
why that
reason I
topic?
raised that topic was because the week before we had been discussing self-control. And one of the things that we said was self-control is a fatigable or a
Oh,
depletable
okay.
resource. So that was number one. Number two was the entire sort of week last week, I had person after person, in the clinic, basically presenting either physically notably fatigued or sort of mentally and emotionally fatigued. And some of the corporate work that I'd been doing, there were people who are of the most resilient people I know who were saying, there was fatigue setting in. So there was professional fatigue. Certainly throughout the last week, there was relational fatigue. So fatigue was a huge subject. And in fact, quite ironically, last night I was quickly, fetching one of my daughters from her dance class, and I quickly had to go through the shop just to get something for dinner.
Okay.
Well, Bron had made dinner, but she just asked for something that I needed to get for her. And I saw a friend of mine, somebody who we've been like promising to get together for 2 years now. He picks up his daughter, and vice versa. And I was just on a call, and I just put the phone down, and I was like, "Hey, how's it going? Good to see you." He said, "I'm just so tired," and I was like, "Okay, so everybody's struggling with fatigue." So I felt quite guilty because I actually felt really energetic with him. But fatigue is a massive issue.
Okay. So I was looking at fatigue and realized there's a quite nice discrimination.
Hmm.
So fatigue is a daily, and this is what I would kind of like when I was going over. Fatigue is daily lack of energy that cannot be rectified easily with just usual things like sleep. While tiredness is something that I can rectify with one good sleep and, or two couple of nights or just switching off or going for a walk. So I did like that because we are finding that fatigue we are talking about here does not look like, oh, just life got me and last few days have been tough. We are talking about something that settles almost chronically, something that is undercurrent of the sense of life they're having. So that was more what I was picking up.
That's interesting because what you described there is typically how one would clinically determine something or clinically define something. So we would typically, if you ask me what's fatigue, I'd say it's a state of tiredness. Now, if you say, well, what is it clinically? It's
Mm.
probably more along the lines of, well, let's define what that means. It'll be the state, it'll be how one feels, it'll be a duration, it'll be an extent of how much it's sort of spilling over into day to day function and how it's impacting. So, all of those things are usually what come together when one is looking for a clinical definition. So, certainly we can look at it clinically, which is typically what I'm seeing a lot of the time. But I think that a lot of the people are just tired,
Physically tired.
just physically tired, mentally tired, emotionally tired. And, there are those that would fit that cat or the definition that you've sort of given there in terms of fatigue itself, as opposed to a sense of tiredness that a good night's sleep and maybe, cleaning up the diet and a bit of exercise or a walk on the beach might improve. So, fair to distinguish between the two, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so we spoke about mind the gap,
Hmm.
and intuitively, when you now explain it, and we will all go, of course. So
Yes.
to explain mind the gap.
So Mind the Gap is a diagram that I started drawing really about 20 years ago, 21, 22 years ago. I'd been in practice for 2 or 3 years. And what was interesting was I was starting to find that I was seeing young children. I was seeing, 7-year-olds, 8-year-olds, and their parents were bringing them in, and these children were just complaining of being tired, and they were struggling, and they weren't happy, and they were just really they were fatigued. And at the same time, it was around about a time when a very new school was opening very close to where my practice was, and I'm seeing the children, the parents bringing the children, and I'm seeing the teachers, and it seemed at a time when things were really gearing up academically. It was a private school. They obviously were looking to set themselves apart from the ordinary government type setup. And that meant a longer school day, and that meant, more subjects and all of these kinds of things. And what was happening was there was just this generalized sense of tiredness and load and pressure. And what I started doing at that point is I wanted people to understand that when load increases, right, if you could picture a gap, right, between a load line, so a line that I drew, two parallel lines that one represented the load that I'm bearing, whether that was personal or social or family or school or whatever else that was work wise, there's this load, and that's going to be carried by something. And that's what I call the support line or the fuel line. And what I was trying to point to was when you look at the actual demands line, that load increasing, and it was almost seemingly increasing exponentially for a lot of people. Typically, what happens is if you could keep the fuel, right, consistent and increase that, you could maintain the gap.
Yes. And
So
carry.
exactly, and
the-
carry that increased load. And in fact, if you could do that well, it would reach a point where now you're functioning at just a much higher level. There's greater efficiency, there's greater skill, and the performance level is just much, much higher. The problem is the load kept coming. And the natural tendency most people have when the load is coming is not to add the appropriate support and refuel. So I would break it down and I would say, well, when you look at refuel or support, you can have things that are healthy and helpful, and there are things that are instantly rewarding, but not necessarily beneficial. So this would look like this. The healthy things, well, more sleep, more exercise, better diet, more hydration, some sort of stress managing sort of techniques or coping methods versus more alcohol, more caffeine, more tobacco, or whatever else people were going to go ahead and use typically would include less sleep, and all the good things would be substantially reduced. So what would happen is the way I would draw it was there's this increase in demand, and instead of the support keeping up with that to maintain a narrow gap, the support would dip down and the gap would increase very, very quickly. And then I would say, now picture a paperclip. So the paperclip back in the day was something we used quite frequently with patient files and everything. And I would take one and I would sort of straighten it, nice and sharp, and you could scratch something or do whatever else you wanted. And then I would put it back and I would say I could use it again as a paperclip. But if I did that again and again and again, it would start deforming. And at some point when I opened it up, it would break.
Right.
And my point was always, it breaks not because I added some massively new force. I just did the same thing. But the same thing on what was fatigued broke it. And the whole point was mind the gap was if we're not careful about how that gap grows with the increasing demand and the reduction in many respects of the support, the reducing of that line and a growing gap, this was what was leading to the kind of probably more clinical fatigue, dysfunction or dysregulation, and then typically a burnout and a breakdown. So that was the whole diagram of mind the gap. And that was the caution. The caution is we need to be careful. So inevitably what I would do with people in that situation was I'd say, as you see this gap widening, what could we do? Is there anything we can do to the top line? And people inevitably say, well, no. I'd say, well, you could quit your job and you could get rid of friends and you could do all of these things and massively diminish the load line. And they'd say like, yeah, I get, but no, and I can't do that. And I say, exactly. I'm mindful of that. I'm not expecting you to go ahead and do that.
Really? They
Right.
can't do anything?
Back then, I'm leaving it at that. The focus was, clinical healthcare, the focus was, let me show you how to support what load you have to carry. So that was the focus at that point. My focus was not, well, let me give you advice as to possibly how to manage your load better. I do that much more now. Now I'm looking at it and I'm saying, okay, well, let's look at load. And in the same way that I had to look at support as being healthy and unhealthy, now I can look at load and say, well, there's healthy load and there's unhealthy load. So where we can look at it and say, I think we could remove these things that are taking my time, my energy, and sort of my skills and my presence. Even if I can find things that are taking that away and it's wasteful, it's unnecessary, or it's not my priority, well, that is with perspective for life where the shift has occurred for me. So I have these discussions much more along the lines of, let's look at assessing the load and the impact, and yes, paying attention to these other important components of good sleep and supplements and exercise and all of those kinds of things, because they're all essential for mental health, physical health, and mental energy, which at the end of the day is needed for self-control. The point is, I think, in keeping with the mind map discussion, we were heading towards saying, what's a practical way of making sure we're not adding unnecessary load, when the simple fact is we're quite depleted a lot of the time. So there is this state of tiredness. One of the things that we can do is definitely start addressing that sort of internal dialogue and thought process of, is this worth me giving my time, effort, and attention to? And so that was really the discussion.
Okay, so that was a long one. I could have unpacked many things there, but I'm gonna whatever sticks now is.
Yeah, we go for it. What comes to mind?
Okay, so there are two components, right? Demand,
Yep.
and then the support line,
Yep.
right? So if I look at demand, obviously that cannot be changed long term. So do I understand you? The first line, immediate, we can start discussing how to keep you recharged. Now, I can't remove everything over the line. That requires much more consideration in decision making. Work, relationship, parenting, these are heavy gravitational decisions. They really pull a lot of resources when we don't make the right decisions. So I'm guessing before we make that, although they're carrying forward, you enable them to carry while we are discussing what can be improved in each, but you give them to the point that they actually can see better and think better and then come to the table in a better state of mind, if I understand that correctly.
The whole point of the diagram was to show people you cannot afford to neglect the basics. You cannot afford to neglect sleep. You cannot afford to neglect diet. You cannot afford to think you can just cruise along without supporting, possibly with some appropriate supplements, or take a time out. The whole point of the initial diagram was to go ahead and say, you think you can keep going. You think you can keep pushing. You think you can get by on 5 hours of sleep. And you think and you think and you think. I want you to see that it's not possible. That gap will widen and you'll keep going for a period of time, but your functional potential is going to shrink. And as that functional potential shrinks, you're going to have to push more and more. And the default, again, was not to the healthy things. The default is to more caffeine.
But I can see why. I mean, if you are at that state, I mean, the self-care becomes the easiest low-hanging kind of change of consciousness, right? So I want to escape this state as possible. And what is instantaneous? Think about it. I mean, it could be alcohol, it could be food. It's a really dysfunctional self-care, to be honest.
It's a mix.
Yes. So, but I just want to come back to, oops, I lost the thought there.
Okay, well, I'll pick up on that and you come back to it. My apologies for interrupting.
No, because I was just thinking of what you mentioned, and this is strange how people disassociate. So the healthy body is a must for the mind to show up in its best state.
Absolutely.
And it is amazing how much we completely disassociate this.
Do you know why?
I don't know why it's that not intuitive, to be honest, because when people are in pain, I cannot think. They just, when the body really starts sending the storm and he stops you in a halt, like the handbrake, which we all experience, just a strong migraine and all is gone. Like you, or pain in the joint or any kind of and you literally see how much we depend on the body and the state of the body. It's just the body has a kind of takes that delayed kind of screaming into your face, and we literally neglect the initial whispers. We really push through.
It's a great point. We neglect the early signs.
Yes.
So we look at it and we say, I often use I describe the things that you've just spoken about now like this. The body cries.
Yes.
When when we consider again the goal of the body is to survive for as long as possible, whether we think about that or don't think about that, the body is innately trying to be in the best possible shape it can with whatever it's got in the environment that it has. It's trying to live for as long as possible. The more difficult that is, the more the body naturally tends towards a survival state, which has its own physiological implications and pathological implications. And the more we give the body what it requires to live well, that's when we focus and we get longevity, right? And optimal function. So the reason why, again, I like what you described, people would go ahead and where we need that fuel, okay, in terms of good diet and enough sleep and exercise and that, that is in and of itself a load. That doesn't come for nothing. So oftentimes people are inclined to see the load aspect as opposed to the benefit aspect, number one. So they tend to neglect it because they don't have the time and the energy to eat well and
Yeah, of
prepare food and
course.
exercise, etc. And I get that. I mean, that's why
We're
this plays out.
depleted. We're asking actually to use.
100%. So number one, so we always have to consider, is the burden of intervention greater than the potential benefit of
Exactly.
intervention?
Exactly.
Well, in these cases, the point of the diagram was to show we can't afford not to pay attention to these things because if we do, we're in big trouble. So people would go ahead and say, well, I'm not doing the healthy things because it takes too much time, energy, effort, etc. And very often the things that they give themselves to, again, in terms of the kind of fast food or the things that are instantly satisfying. Fatigue is not a pleasant experience. Tiredness is not a nice feeling. So when we're in that state, remember, the mind in pursuit and preservation of maximal satisfaction tends to go ahead and say, well, let's rescue the mood. Let's rescue the feeling. So the feelings rescue is I want to feel better in the moment. And a lot of the feelings rescue is giving me a sense of I'm being re-energized. And that's going to be the caffeine and these kinds of things. So we give ourselves to the things that are actually going to cause greater consequence down the line because they're instantly satisfying. They're usually not that taxing in terms of they're easy to get. They give an instant fix, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is nothing for nothing. So when you go that particular route, which is what most people under pressure do, most people under pressure do not improve their lifestyle. Their lifestyles degenerate. And as a result, we have the typical pathological things that come in. We get issues with blood pressure. We get issues with, even arrhythmias. We get issues with so many things, inflammatory states and gut issues, and so many of the typical chronic types of issues, whether it be reflux or gastritis. The bottom line is when the body is in a state of survival, it has to, unfortunately, sacrifice a tremendous amount that would relate obviously to optimal function, longevity, and well-being. It's just, again, it's the body prioritizes usually quite well. But the point is that's often to the detriment of how I feel and how I function. So we have to support it. And unfortunately, again, that often takes self-control.
So it's interesting what you said, and as you were speaking, it crossed my mind that as we look at our responsibilities, right? So we literally cannot say anything that this relationship, it's so work. I can't say no. So there quite often we say I can't, it's part of my job. I just can't say no because I'm tired or I have to take a rest. Relationship again toward kids. I mean, with the responsibility, I can't say no. Then toward the spouse, partner, I can't say no. But then toward self, yeah, I can actually take that as a last on the list,
And
really,
the
because the
reason,
consequences feel,
Mhm.
it's induced on me. I mean, I just take the consequence, but others, it looks like a greater consequence. It looks like a bigger loss threat if I don't fulfill in relationship to work, in the relationship to
Absolutely,
partner. So how do so that checking out just is easier on ourselves.
which is part of one of the things we have to understand about self-concept. Usually we might do that out of a sense of responsibility, but it's also because we believe we can. And that is oftentimes rooted in arrogance. It's an inflated view of self. In other words, I think I can get by on 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night. I have people say that to me all the time. And my response is, you might think that. The simple fact is that's not the design. Whether it's 7 or whether it's 8 or whether it's 8.5, I'm not going to argue that. But the bottom is 4 or 5. It's just not going to be enough. Oh, but I've been doing it for years. Yeah, how are you? Well,
He said so.
well, how's that working for you? Right? There's a reason you're sitting with me. And it's not because your body's coping with 4.5 or 5 hours of sleep a night and all the other things.
Well, it's a badge of honor, you know that. I mean,
Yeah,
recently,
fair.
recently, well, we saw that when I asked you, how are you? I mean, it was a must to say I'm busy. It was like, it was a really badge of honor. I'm busy. I'm really busy. And it meant you're productive. It kind of encapsulated a lot of these social currencies we were tossing around as a must for you to validate yourself, right?
Can I
So I'm
throw something?
busy. I don't sleep. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm crashing it, man.
Can
I'm
I throw
crashing. I'm
something
like,
in there? You're right. That is a badge of honor, but it's also please don't add anything to my load. It's also a means of I'm so busy. Please don't give me anything else. So it's
uh,
a means of
could
escape as well.
be.
It's both. It's
Yeah,
both.
sure.
It's a matter
The
of
voice of, I mean, tone of voice was usually with pride. So I don't know
yes.
about that.
Well, again, people in that state are usually not asking for more work.
No, no,
It's
that's
also a
true.
matter of just let me keep you at arm's length here, just while I tell you how
Don't
busy I
add.
am. Don't add to this. Whatever you were coming to ask, they're certainly not going to be able to do that.
But
That's a separate
can I
subject.
just, going back on demand? No, there is alignment with reality. It's really important. Comes in very strongly here. So there are real, life is never linear, you know, and it comes and goes and it comes kind of very thick and dense sometimes. And you can have a very realistic, really burden that comes to you at one point. It can be sickness, it can be death, it can be
Yeah.
really great loss that is just, horrible to experience. And that, I think we see that when there is a lack of support, we kind of come in very quickly with not only just self-regulation in your daily habits, but then when you really need just person to be allowed to breathe again, knowing that they cannot carry alone. So that is realistically people can meet in their life. And but what we demand we're talking about now here is actually quite often self-induced. It's almost self-inflicted. And then we see really poorly managed expectations. So they're skewed from reality quite often. And
Hmm.
I think this is what we said quite a lot, that how do you know you can't say no? How do you make priorities? Where are your priorities? How do you make priorities? Because
Mm.
actually every yes is in line with some belief.
Yep.
I should say yes because, and this is not quite often examined. And I think what happens when you sit with them is that there are really expectations or beliefs that are taken as absolute truth. Like I cannot, and then there's some. So could you a little bit unpack what have you seen in practice when people say why or how do they make priorities and how those priorities are based on some of the not really good decision making there?
Well, I would say to you that a lot of people have not given enough thought to the priorities, or they assume that their priorities are their priorities and they state them well, but they don't prioritize them. There's a big difference between a
Okay.
person saying, oh, my priority is my relationship and my family. I just don't see them very often, right? The idea, what I'm
Oh,
saying to you
okay.
is people say what they know, people often do. I usually say what they believe, but they do what they think is most important to them in the moment. So a person who sacrifices family and sacrifices being, present for sake of pursuing other things, if you ask them what's most important to you, they'll often say, well, the people I'm sacrificing for. Well, there's a difference between sacrificing for and sacrificing in your attempt to take care of them. And this is where there's often a disconnect. So it's not that people don't necessarily know their priorities. I think the confusion comes in is are they using those priorities as a means for making their decisions? And that's where I think the downfall often comes is people are making decisions that they think will be beneficial for those whom they prioritize, but oftentimes they're not factoring those people or those things in sufficiently to make the kinds of decisions that are genuinely, meaningfully helpful and beneficial all around. So, as we say with Perspective for Life all the time, and you've been alluding to it now, keep it real, keep it simple. And sometimes keeping it simple is what is my priority? And is this that's going to demand my time and my energy right now going to contribute to what I truly say are my priorities? And if the answer is yes, we'll do it even in a fatigued state. And if the answer is no, well, you need to go ahead and be a little bit more careful. So I think that subject on priorities is a massively important one and maybe something we can discuss at a later stage. But I would love to just wrap this one up. And I'm going to ask you, on the basis of our discussion right now, if we were thinking about that mind the gap, what would maybe something, maybe two or three things be that would enable us to um, either reduce the load or, really be a simple, practical way of adding support? Put you on the spot.
Okay, you put me on the spot. So I personally suffer from inability to say no. Um, so I guess that's admitting to arrogance. I quite often examine why I actually quite cannot allow myself a permission to know, say a no. And I even in my priorities, it's just all the time at the same time, burning with the same fire. I think it's really hard. Now I realize that I do, and this is what I started recently doing. So work often bleeds after the work hours.
Mhm.
And I find myself really performing in the mediocre level, honestly, because of this quite often. And so I consciously now stop, although I can see the to-do list, like literally
Yeah.
I can visualize, I literally, now the work is done. You don't have to do anything. Like that's it. You just have to separate. So the first thing I'm habituating myself that that's it. That's a time that you have to look for something else. So if the family is there, if my husband is there, Anna, I now have to fill it in with something to do with them, something to do with health, something to do with relaxation, so I mean, I literally have to consciously now practice this. What I love, and I mean, this came up quite recently, thanks to you guys, we were talking about, is that I'm doing it at a time of peace. So there's nothing pressing right now, and I have enough space to practice this habit where it's gonna come to use when things are really going
I like
out
that.
of whack. So I think I made a mistake to learn to swim when I'm thrown in the water, and drowning there. I think it's much better to when I'm really refreshed and I don't feel pressure to learn some of these skills. That so it's no and really cutting, structuring my day. So and repeating because to-do list always comes back. I mean, there's never that to-do list is a bottomless
Yeah.
list. It's just
Life is
it's
relentless.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it
Yeah.
just keeps adding. So nothing today I do will prevent another thing to come. So I'm not sure what I'm buying myself apart from a more and more tiredness.
Mm.
And so yeah. So I don't know if that answers,
Yeah,
but
I think that's great. In many respects, say no to the things that you need to in order to refresh. And you listed a couple of extra things to do in there. I think it's
I
important
do
to
love your questions that you gave us during the talk.
on that talk. Maybe
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
let's
it
discuss that
echoes
next time.
so
Well,
strong
in the next
now.
call, let's focus on that. I will focus in on that
Yeah, I
particular
love
one.
them. I just love them.
And then I think it's helpful to recognize again that fatigue is a big deal. Fatigue cannot be underestimated. It impacts on every facet. And in that talk,
Yes,
in that call, I said it's mental, it's emotional, it's physical, it's social, it's environmental, and it's spiritual.
yes.
That's every facet of life.
If I can add, and I shouldn't be, we're
No,
just
we're over time.
no,
We're over
no, come
time.
on, I love it.
Wrap it
But
up.
okay, I'm gonna wrap it up. We connected the best self-control that's sourced on identity and
Mm.
values. But when we are physically tired, it's really hard to show up a lot in that line.
I would say to you that let's discuss that next because that's the best time to do it.
Oh, okay.
That is the best time to do it.
Wow.
Okay. Thanks, Renix.
Thanks, man.